Good afternoon. I'm Jim Dorn, Vice President for Academic Affairs at the Cato Institute. It's a great pleasure to have you here today to join us to honor Lord Peter Bauer, to whom this book is dedicated. There's copies of the book outside for sale, but for those of you that may not be able to get a copy today, you could call Cato at 1-800-767-1241 or use the cyberspace and get into our website. It's just www.cato.org. Steve Hankey also joins us today, back from his Indonesia adventures, and we're delighted to have Steve with us. Unfortunately, the other editor of the book, Sir Alan Walters, is not going to be able to join us today, but Peter, he sends his best regards to you. And we do have several of the authors of the book here as well. Charles Rowley, Paul Craig Roberts, Doug Bandow, and Wayne Braw have been able to join us today. So we're very pleased to have these authors with us as well. I'd also like, before beginning, to acknowledge the generous support of the Earhart Foundation, who's helped in this project from beginning to end. And of course, also thank our president, Ed Crane, for his support in this particular project. You know, Peter Bauer first came to Cato in May 1986 when we had a conference about his work. And at that time, he told me that this was his swan song back in 1986. Since that time, he's written several books, a number of major articles. He's got a new book forthcoming next year, and he has an article forthcoming in the Cato Journal in the next issue. So he's certainly been staying busy. Now, when I called Peter to ask him to come to the United States, Nancy Upham had already spoken to him and said, "Now, Peter, please cooperate with Jim," and so forth, because I like to call him quite late. And when I called Peter, he said, "I know what you want." And I said, "You do?" He said, "Yeah, you want me to come to Cato and then you want to set up something in London for me." And I said, "That's true." So he went along with it. It was basically because of Nancy Upham's help. And she related a story to me that Peter told her. And Peter said that he reminded her of the story of the scorpion and the frog, where the scorpion wants to get a ride across the pond on the frog's back, but the frog said, "No, I won't do it because you're going to sting me and kill me." So finally the scorpion convinced the frog to go across the pond, and about halfway across the pond, the scorpion stung the frog. And the frog said, "Why did you do that? Now we're both going to die." And the scorpion said, "Well, it's just my nature." So Peter said, "It's just my nature." And he is a tough fella, and you got to realize what he's been through over his career. At the beginning, he was the lone voice in the wilderness, really combating conventional economic development wisdom. And he really stung that creature, and he killed it, but he survived. And for that, we're very, very happy. His life really illustrates that hard work, a strong will, and an enterprising spirit can overcome tremendous odds and win the day. He comes from a working-class family in Hungary. In fact, Bauer means peasant in Hungarian, I understand, to become a member of the House of Lords. As I said, Bauer's work was initially scorned by the high priests of development economics. He questioned their sacred beliefs, namely the vicious circle of poverty and the need for comprehensive central planning and foreign aid to get out of the so-called poverty trap. He emphasized basic economic logic, and he observed reality to find out what worked and what didn't in generating the wealth of nations. In that sense, he follows in the footsteps of Adam Smith. Now, to give you a taste of what the conventional wisdom was for a long time, Stanford economist Paul Barron wrote in 1957, The establishment of a socialist planned economy is an essential, indeed indispensable, condition for the attainment of economic and social progress in underdeveloped countries. This is somebody from Stanford. This was widely accepted at the time and for a long time thereafter. Now, what was Bauer's central conclusion? It was, to quote, "Economic achievement primarily depends on people's abilities and attitudes." Notice that he says economic achievement, not economic growth or anything like that, but economic achievement depends on people's abilities and attitudes, and also on their social and political institutions. Differences in these determinants or factors largely explain differences in the levels of economic achievement and the rates of material progress. Now, commenting on Peter Bauer's work, economist Thomas Sowell wrote, "Professor Peter T. Bauer is one of those intellectually heroic figures who has stood fast against the fads and hysteria of his time. While vast currents of development economics inundated us with overpopulation theories and vicious circle poverty doctrines that depicted massive foreign aid as the only salvation of the third world, Bauer said no. And he said it loud and clear, but virtually alone." As Nobel laureate Jim Buchanan, who's here with us today, noted, quote, "Bauer's ideas have been vindicated by a half-century of history." And that's certainly true. The collapse of the Soviet Union shows the futility of central planning. The failure of foreign aid from the World Bank and other organizations in Africa and elsewhere shows that foreign aid increases dependence, not independence. Moral hazard from IMF lending, recently seen in Southeast Asia, provides what Peter Ackerman, who's here today, and myself wrote in the Financial Times a couple years ago after the Mexican crisis, quote, "a dose of financial morphine." Doug Bando, Paul Craig Roberts, two contributors to the book, discuss the foreign aid issue and the IMF and other organizations and the problems they pose for economic development. Recent empirical work, some reported in this book, shows close relationship between economic freedom and material progress. And Steve Hankey and a colleague of his, Stephen Walters, just wrote the lead article in the Cato Journal. There's some reprints outside summarizing all the empirical evidence that shows the strong relationship between economic liberty and economic progress. So Bauer was right, and conventional wisdom was wrong. This book tells why. Some themes of the book are the importance of institutions in the process of economic development, both the formal institutions and the informal institutions. The formal institutions include limited government, private property, and freedom of contract, which produce open markets. But along with that, you need certain codes of conduct. Respect for persons and property cannot ultimately be enforced by law. They must be part of culture and upbringing, as Doug North has so often pointed out. And Doug North, of course, who's a Nobel laureate, has a very interesting chapter in the book about these themes. Thus, individual freedom and how it is used are fundamental to individual well-being and economic progress. Government failure to protect life, liberty, and property, not market failure, is the root of perpetuating poverty. Carl Brunner points this out in his essay in the book. Bauer in this book reflects a deep respect for the dignity, rationality, and capabilities of poor people around the world. All people can lift themselves out of poverty if the right institutions, the right attitudes, and the right behavior prevail. And these rules are not difficult, they're simple. They've always been necessary for human success. namely hard work, fortitude, and foresight. Population growth, Julian Simon points out in the book, and we all deeply mourn the loss of Julian. He was a close friend of Cato's. He greatly admired Peter Bauer and was influenced by his work, and Peter Bauer greatly admires Julian Simon's work. Julian argued in his essay that population growth is not a drag on development. And like Simon, Bauer has great belief in human progress and the overcoming of obstacles. The ultimate resource is the individual, not the state. Bauer once wrote, quote, "The birth of a calf represents an increase in living standards, according to national income accounts. But the birth of a child represents a fall, because per capita income declines." I always thought that was very perceptive. And of course, Bauer is very perceptive. His essay, The Disregard of Reality, is brilliant. And he's always looked at the real world, at the facts, whether it was the Malaysian rubber industry or the West Africa ground nuts, to see how things operated on the ground, and then combined his economic principles to show how things work and why wealth is created. He's criticized the mathematization of economics, calling it fancy clothes with nothing inside. And it steered us away from simple truths and perpetuated economic fallacies. In reality, the market, not the plan, is the natural way to organize economic life. Excessive government upsets the spontaneous market order and politicizes life. Limited government, individual freedom, and private property mean individuals have a stake in the outcome of their endeavors. In this process, the rules of the game and the way the game is played matter greatly. The Constitution and an ethos of economic liberty are extremely important. As James Buchanan has pointed out, it's constitutional political economy that matters a great deal, understanding institutions, incentives, and behavior, versus the arbitrary rules, the lack of a rule of law, the excessive government, the wealth redistribution that characterizes many economies today, which leads to rent-seeking. And of course, Charles Raleigh, in his essay in the book, lends a public choice aspect to the study of development economics. In conclusion, let me read from Václav Klaus's foreword to the book, entitled The Market Liberal Revolution. And this reiterates the key ingredients of economic development and certainly reflects Bauer's influence. Klaus wrote, "Human history and our own experience prove that social and economic progress spring both from the individual's efforts to do something positive and from his freedom to follow his own objectives and interests. Where social interests emerge from the power of government, they bring oppression rather than freedom, corruption rather than the rule of law, and decay rather than efficiency and equity. This general rule is valid for the whole world, for developed and developing countries, for Arctic cold and equatorial heat, for mountains and lowlands, for all of us." That's a very powerful statement and a very true statement. Foreseeing this early on and for struggling to defend individual dignity and freedom, Lord Bauer is indeed a hero of the market liberal revolution that is now sweeping the globe. For this, he deserves our sincere thanks. It's a great honor and pleasure to now introduce Professor Bauer. Now, Lord Bauer asked me to keep his introduction very short, so I will. Lord Bauer is Professor Emeritus of Economics, London School of Economics, a Fellow of the British Academy, author of numerous articles and books, including Dissent on Development, Equality of the Third World and Economic Delusion, Reality and Rhetoric, and the Development Frontier. all published by Harvard University Press. Now, Lord Bauer will speak briefly, and then Steve Hankey, whom I'll introduce, will speak, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
I'm very glad. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here to celebrate Cato's publications of the Revolution in Development Economics. I want to thank Cato for dedicating this book to me. Cato's confidence in my work has been very helpful and encouraging. And I am also most grateful to the Earhart Foundation, which has supported my work for a very long time. Both Cato and Earhart have a sort of stiletto effect. Small, sharply targeted resources have great effect and influence. With Stephen Hankey, just back from Indonesia, I feel I should say something about the activities of the IMF and the World Bank, that is the Bretton Woods twins. The IMF was established to assist governments facing short-term balance of payments problems under a regime of fixed exchange rates. The World Bank was set up in the belief that poor countries have no access to external commercial finance, which was deemed necessary to help them to break a vicious circle of poverty and stagnation. Both the IMF and the World Bank have vastly expanded since they were first established, and have for many years been engaged in activities quite unrelated to their original purposes. The IMF has become a major aid agency and something of a credit rating institution, a kind of worldwide Moody's. The World Bank has never been necessary because both governments and the private sector in poor countries can readily borrow abroad, perhaps too readily. Now, looking at the World Bank, it must be remembered that this is not a bank, but a political institution. Its board is appointed by governments, its capital is supplied by governments, and its obligations are sometimes explicitly and others implicitly government guaranteed. And its activities reflect its official character. For instance, the International Development Association, a World Bank affiliate, gives out unindexed loans for 50 years at zero interest. These are in effect grants, not loans. Now the World Bank and the IMF are official, that is, tax-financed institutions. Now I shall conclude my remarks with two relevant intertwined adages. First, nothing official ever comes to an end completely. Second, an observation by US Senator Strom Thurmond, who said, "You cannot get a hog to slaughter itself." In trying to rein in the IMF and the World Bank, Cato has his work cut out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I told you he would be brief, but he will take questions, so we should have plenty of time for questions after Steve speaks. Steve Hankey is Professor of Applied Economics at the Johns Hopkins University. He served as a senior economist on President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors, and he is, according to Merton Miller, a Nobel Prize economist, the world's leading expert on currency boards, but we know that already here. He's been an advisor to a number of leaders in Argentina, Lithuania, and most recently Indonesia, to President Suharto. Probably all seen articles in the last several weeks about Steve. And it should have read maybe Steve versus Goliath. He's fighting Clinton, the IMF, other world leaders. Hashimoto called Suharto, told him not to adopt a currency board. But Steve's standing tall. And it's interesting to see that there was a graph in the Wall Street Journal when the IMF came in and started to offer bailout money, the rupiah continued to slide. But when Steve started to advise Suharto on a currency board, the rupiah started to rise. And I talked to Steve about this, and he calls this the Hanke effect, which I think is a good name. Former Vice President Walter Mondale was just advising Suharto. That's the latest big gun that they've sent over. And he had 19 minutes with President Suharto. Steve Hanke told me that he had about 10 hours. So we'll see how persuasive Steve is in the next couple months, I guess. During which, by the way, he gave President Suharto a copy of our book and told him to read Peter Bauer's essays. So that was a good thing. Steve?
Thank you, Jim. Lord Bauer. One thing Jim did forget to mention, he did say that Lord Bauer would be brief, I would add, to the point. Let me just first say that the publication of this book has really been one of the most satisfying things in my professional career, because it does honor one of the great economists in the world today, a man of courage, integrity, character, and most importantly, a true friend. I first was introduced to Lord Bauer's work many years ago. One of my professors, another great economist, John M. Castles, of the law of variable proportions. People don't study those kind of things anymore, so at any rate, the article was a bit dated now, 1936. Castles recommended Bauer, and he said he's one of the few economists that knows his economics and knows his economies. And the first book, Peter, I read, I still have it. It's getting a little yellow. The pages, The Economics of Underdeveloped Countries, Bauer and Yammy. And to indicate how long ago this was, I see the price was $1.75. But at any rate, it's still very current. I looked at it a little bit this morning, and it's got it all. Nothing has really changed very much. As a result of reading Bauer and Yammy, I really got hooked on Bauer, and even when I couldn't afford it, I took out a subscription to Encounter, because Peter was writing in Encounter quite regularly in those days, and of course it was a great joy to pick up that thing and read a good Bauer article. Then in the 70s, Sir Alan Walters and I hooked up at Johns Hopkins when Alan came, I think it was about 1974, and of course Alan had been a colleague of Peter's at LSE, and I wanted to learn more about the real Bauer, and at any rate, everything Alan told me just confirmed what I already thought. And then we're to 1981, and that's the first time I ever actually heard Peter and had an opportunity to meet him. And he gave a lecture in Washington, D.C. at the time, and Mrs. Hanke told me after the lecture, the first economist I've heard who really is impressive. And those damn French standards will get you every time. But in closing, Peter, let me just say that the chapter that Professor Dowdle and I contributed to the book deals with a benefit-cost analysis of changing from communal ownership of timberlands to private ownership of timberlands, and we really did. This is I think a classic Bauer kind of piece, because we do have a few little new analytical innovations in there, and then in addition we did our field work, and I can report that Dowdle and I literally cruised all 12,000 acres of timber that we were evaluating. This wasn't a job that was conducted behind the desk at IMF headquarters here in Washington. So I think I can just open up for questions, and it's just great to be here with you, Peter. And I hope you think the product merits the tribute that we've made to you. Thank you.
Okay, we have plenty of time for questions, so if you have a question to ask, please just raise your hand, and if you could give us your affiliation and keep the question short, and direct it to, you can direct it to Lord Bauer or to Professor Hankey. Yes.
I have a question specifically for Professor John Burloff, Investors Business Daily. I have a question specifically for Professor Hankey, but Lord Bauer is welcome to comment on it if he wants to. Professor Hankey, in your 10 hours with President Suharto, have you ever advised him to tell the IMF, just to tell the IMF, to hell with you, we're setting up a currency board, we don't need your money? And if not, why not?
Well, on my return from Jakarta, I did stop off Friday to see the investment bankers in Singapore, and then saw additional investment bankers in Zurich on Saturday. I think that might answer your question. And in addition, I should add that Wednesday, the Sultan of Brunei and President Suharto had lunch together.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a management consultant. Had a question for Lord Bauer. In comparing how development economics works in the third world versus the second world, the countries that have recently emerged from communism, what are the similarities and differences you observe?
Well, I think the ex-communist countries face difficulties.
Is that on?
Is the mic on?
No.
Is this one on?
Yeah.
I think the ex-communist countries face difficulties much greater than those of so-called third world countries, because the majority of people in the ex-communist countries have been brought up under a command economy. The idea of looking for jobs, job search, or establishing enterprises is completely new to them. They don't know that. They've always been directed. And that is very hard to, how shall I say, habits of mind to get rid of. Now, third world countries do not face this difficulty. To emerge from a relatively poor state is not difficult in the sense which is difficult, say, to people in Soviet Union or Poland, who've been brought up under a system by which they were completely directed. I think these are much greater difficulties than those of facing third world countries. Have I answered the question? Please, if you address questions to me, you can be as critical as you like, even hostile.
Walter, do you have a question?
I have a question
Yes.
for Stephen Hankey. Steve, could you help us all by telling us whether we should take a long position or a short position on Indonesian currency?
I think the only one that knows the answer is President Suharto.
Yes.
Professor Bauer, Arthur Alexander, Japan Economic Institute here in Washington, but I sat in your class at LSE in 1964 and 65 and heard you say at the time that governments ought to stick to doing the things that are absolutely necessary for governments to do. and not do things that they ought not to be doing, and are going to just mess up the things that they ought to be doing. I'm curious about in this, it's been 30 years since then, the financial systems have become much more complicated since then, with more international flows of capital and more complex domestic financial arrangements. Is domestic financial regulation and oversight one of those important things that government ought to do, or should that also be left to private parties to look after?
I would say that it would be left very largely to the private sector, but of course there must be institutions in place to ensure that contracts are fulfilled. I should say that, there's organizations such as in England now, the Serious Fraud Office should be in place. But that is very different from detailed financial regulation.
Janet Gutzman from Reuters. I'm sorry to come back to currency boards, but do you think the currency board will go ahead in Indonesia, and if so, when? I know a few weeks ago you were talking about 2 to 3 weeks it could be done.
I think it will go ahead. I can't give you a precise timetable because, again, President Suharto will decide. I'm just an economic advisor. What would I know?
Charles Rowley from the Locke Institute, and the questions to Dr. Hankey. I'm specifically not asking you to comment on the Indonesia situation in this question. There has been some discussion, notably by Christopher Lingle, that one of the problems, and likely to be a serious problem for the fast-growing East Asian countries, is the problem of authoritarian nature of the capitalist system, that it is not, in a sense, democratic capitalism, but in many ways autocratic capitalism. I wonder if you have any views on that.
Well, I think the best way to rein in the autocrats is to rein in their powers in both the monetary and fiscal sphere. And to my way of thinking, the best way to do this is to put handcuffs on them in the monetary sphere, and you do that with the currency board system because the currency board can't issue credit. So it in fact gives you all three things that Secretary Rubin indicated in his testimony before the House Banking Committee on January 30th that he desired in Southeast Asia. He wanted a strong currency that doesn't have anything necessarily to do with an autocrat, but he did want transparency, and with the currency board you have to post the books every day, so they're very transparent. You do in fact know what's going on, what the reserves are, and what the monetary liabilities of the monetary authority are. And the third thing, they reduce the potential for corruption enormously because they can't issue credit. Now, in addition to that, of course, they put a hard budget constraint on the monetary authority, and this tends to discipline the fiscal authorities because the fisc can't go to the monetary authority for credit. If they want to spend money, they've either got to tax or borrow, and there are moderate constraints on both of those, and that's why in most currency board countries you find the fiscal balance more or less in balance, whether it's old-fashioned currency boards or even the modern ones that we have. So it's a handcuffing device that, or straitjacketing device that if you're worried about autocrats, it's just what the doctor ordered. And just one remark on the Indonesian case, one of the charges, of course, that the G7 and in particular the Treasury Department, which is running our foreign policy now, seems to not trust President Suharto. They have a problem with him. So I don't know why they're objecting to a currency board, because he's voluntarily said that he's going to put handcuffs on himself.
Yes, way in the back.
Ed Hudgens, Cato Institute. Argentina is an example of a country that earlier in this century was quite prosperous, but which adopted statist policies and in fact made itself into a less developed country. It's now, of course, trying to climb out of its situation. Do you see, Lord Bauer and Steve, you can add anything if you'd like, a danger that other countries, for example, European countries that have heavily statist policies could actually slip back and become less developed, or perhaps a country like Korea if they can't change their ways in the near future?
Yes. Shall I answer it there?
Yeah, go ahead. You can answer right here.
Well, I think, you see, in Europe, particularly under the European Union and the forthcoming European Monetary Union, I think there is a danger, a considerable danger, of increased government intervention with deleterious effects. But the basics of people's attitudes and traditional institutions are sufficiently strong to resist this to a considerable extent. You see, people often, in my criticism of foreign aid, I've often encountered the argument that look at the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is an example, so they say, of the effectiveness of foreign aid. Now, the thing about that is that that's completely misleading in the context of foreign aid to less developed countries, because the economies of Europe had to be restored, not developed. That's why the Marshall Plan, or the European Recovery Program, as it was officially called, could be terminated in 4 years, whereas in aid to the third world countries now going on for 50 years, and its advocates often say it will have to go on to the 21st century and beyond. Now, same way, I mean, I think the European economies can stand a good deal of mismanagement. They will experience mismanagement, but I don't see them relaxing to third world status.
What about the French people's attitude, Steve?
We'll cover that at lunch, Ed. This thing is on television, Ed.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm David Bowes with Cato. I'd like to know what Lord Bauer has to say about the question about authoritarian capitalism. The countries like Singapore and Taiwan and Korea and some of the others in that area who have been accused of crony capitalism, of authoritarian political systems, and the question of whether Christopher Lingle was correct when he was here and predicted that the authoritarian natures of their economies would lead them to slow down economically as well as having unpleasant political habits.
Here the critical question is not democracy versus autocracy. The critical question is limited government. That method. Look, one of the most undemocratic countries in the world for generations now has been Hong Kong. What the governor says goes. There were until recently no elections, whatever. And yet it was both the freest country and one of the most prosperous countries, because it was limited government. That is what needs to be emphasized.
Yeah.
David's giving me the microphone.
Oh, Steve? Yeah, okay.
This is a question for Lord Bauer. I was wondering if you have any thoughts, to follow up the earlier question about the formerly communist countries. Any thoughts on the sequence of reform and the speed of reform in terms of what is the best way to get to the end result, I think, universally shared in this room?
This is very, very difficult to predict. How shall I say, there are those who say one clean blow is the best way. Others say gradualism is the most best way. You need to know the culture, the character of these societies before you can say anything with any confidence about it. I think they are facing very great difficulties. not only, which I mentioned already earlier, that people have been brought up under comprehensive command economy and don't know anything else, but also the most enterprising and resourceful people have been in the government. And they stayed there. Now, in fact, now you see such elections as they are in the East European countries show a very strong tendency to re-elect the people who have been there before.
Let me.
Yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, the one thing I would say on that is that you really need stability to make any headway in terms of liberal economic reforms. If you don't have general macroeconomic stability, it's very hard to move ahead, either in a big bang approach or a gradual approach. So a necessary but not sufficient condition for liberal economic reforms is to have general macroeconomic stability. You can't reform if you're in either a very high or hyperinflation mode, for example, or if your currency is, like Indonesia, lost 75% of its value in 8 months.
Yes, why don't we take a question down here? This gentleman's been waiting. You had a question? Well, actually, the person back there, Gabriel, you can go next. Okay, Gabriel's next.
Question for Lord Bauer. We've heard earlier a bit about the conventional unwisdom of development economics in the 50s and 60s, about planned economies and import substitution. I was wondering what your assessment of the current state of the field is. I mean, how much wiser has the conventional wisdom gotten, and how much progress is there remaining?
There has been a good deal of progress, but strong resistance still remains. I mean, in fact, I should say the Western academies are the last stronghold of the advocacy of economic planning. And for example, a very prominent exponent of the communist philosophy is a man called Eric Hobsbawm. He was a recently retired professor of economic history at London. He recently said that nothing has made him to change his opinions. He's exactly of the same opinion as he was before.
Yeah, Peter, on that note, I don't know if you saw the Weekend FT in the last few weeks, maybe it was last weekend, they had a lunch with Ken Galbraith, and Ken is in the same camp. You haven't penetrated Ken yet.
Who is it?
Kenneth Galbraith.
No, there's no prospect of that.
Gabriel?
I'm Gabriel Roth, one of the few people here who know nothing about currency economics. I would like to ask for clarification of a question asked previously about what could be government role in maintaining the stability of the currency. And let's get away from Indonesia, but ask about this country or about the United Kingdom. Should the government be involved in determining or influencing interest rates? How should the government assure the stability of the currency? I assume that a currency board for the United States would be out of the question because there's no currency to tie it to. Would you favor tying the currency to gold or to a commodity basket? What would you suggest to enhance freedom in currency? Question to both speakers.
Well, I should say, to maintain the monetary growth at a rate consistent with the rise, the increase in gross national product. I think it is the control of the money supply. This is a critical thing. That's by far the most important element. There are minor variants of the theme, but that is, I think, the major element, the control of the money supply. Now, it has been argued, some of you probably know, it'll also be left to the private sector. that although that the private banks will control the issue of their own liabilities in such a way as to avoid bankruptcy, and that would ensure a steady growth, but not excessive growth of the money supply. I've never looked into this sufficiently, but I know there are differences of opinion on that. For example, I think a different opinion between, say, Friedman and Hayek.
Well, my own preference is for the Hayek alternative, because I do agree with the Austrians that at the end of the day, central banks, government central banks, are really agencies for central planning. However, I think we'll probably end up discussing these issues in the confines of the Cato Institute for a number of years.
Of course, we just put out a book about a year ago called The Future of Money in the Information Age, because now we have cyber cash coming on board, so that raises some interesting questions as well. I think we can take one more question, and then we'll be breaking for lunch up in the Winter Garden, and I hope you can all join us. Yes, why don't we take this question here? Yeah, go ahead.
This is a question, I think, for Lord Bauer. One of the problems that is occurring with third world countries is massive amounts of corruption. And you could even say it's culturally imbued with corruption, that the idea is that people work for the government, they therefore can use corruption as a way of enhancing their pocketbooks. How